The opposition have put forward their argument, and they've outlined to us the humanitarian circumstances that currently persist in Syria and how tragic they are, and the government shares their view. The opposition also mentioned the Assad regime and the years of repression and oppression that took place in Syria prior to the transformation, prior to the revolution. The fact that Bashar al-Assad has no legitimacy now, or limited legitimacy, and that there's great sympathy on the part of the international community for the rebel movement.
And I would just like to point out that I am no more in favor of the status quo than the government is. The status quo is currently unacceptable. The question is, how do we manage to get away from the status quo in a way that moves us toward a better set of arrangements than the status quo? And that's where our disagreement is.
Intervention noted that military intervention can make things worse. And so is that true? Can military intervention make things worse? And I'll say yes, it can, just as I would hope the other side would concede that military intervention can make things better. It depends on the case. But usually, more often than not, military intervention does make things better rather than worse.
How worse can it be? I guess we can just have to look to our east, which is Iraq, I guess. So that's not very, very hard to answer. Another question that the honorable member for the government posed, what happens? They mentioned that, oh no, we don't want a full-scale war, we just want a limited, clean and neat war. And what happens, I ask the honorable member, if limited-scale military intervention doesn't work? So what do we do next? We increase the intensity? For example, if Milosevic hadn't decided for strategic reasons to cave in to the NATO bombing, NATO forces were ready for a ground invasion, which would have been much, much more difficult to execute, and which would have much greater casualties.
Is comparing Libya to Syria really the true test of how we should gauge this, or is comparing Libya after the intervention to Libya before the intervention a better means of understanding that? And in that regard, I think that, again, as much as I'm not a big fan of the Gaddafi government, certainly the impact of the intervention did bring about the disintegration of the Libyan state and considerable levels of disorder, and destroyed in many respects one of the most developed countries in Africa, reducing it to one of the least developed regions in Africa.
Now it's an ego battle between the two centers of power of Islam, where the Shia majority countries like Iran, backed by Russia, is backing Syria, while we have the Sunni majority countries, especially Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, who have more Western inclinations, and they are more for intervention in Syria. So how important is this divide between different sects inside Islam on the Syrian civil war?
I would argue that there's a kind of a hierarchy to what you want to do when you do nation building. I think you want to start off with the first thing you have to do is security. You have to be able to provide security, because if you don't have that, you can't do anything else. If you can't provide a safe environment, and then after you have that, then the second step would be to try to achieve good governance, and then after that you try to achieve justice and reconciliation, and then finally economic and social development. And it's important to go in the right order, because like I said, if you try to establish good governance but you don't have proper security, criminals are running roughshod, then it's not going to work. So I think there's certainly a process you need to go through when you're nation building.
I know a lot of people talk about social implications of the war or military intervention, but no one really spoke about economic kind of implications of it. And if you do take those into account, I do believe the war would be beneficial.
So when you look at the economy of Syria, the very basic notion is that people have to find a way to stay in the country. If we're going to have 9-10 million refugees in the country and no incentive to come back, you're not going to build an economy. So military intervention, yes, but military intervention only if it protects civilians and only if it creates some sort of long-term plan conjoined with a political process that says, okay, Syria is here to stay, and economic dip or not, the longer term vision is one of where people actually reinvent themselves economically in that country, right? It's
The military intervention in Iraq, their number was reduced from 2,500,000 to 70,000. What will happen to the Greek Orthodox Church of Antioch if the Islamists will take control of Syria? Will they be protected?
Given that they've been offered protection by regimes that are not very democratic and they're not very civil, like the Baathists in Iraq or in Syria, they've had to make, if you excuse my analogy, a pact with the devil. So that leaves them in a very difficult spot, because now their survival, and the numbers, as you mentioned, are going down, to some extent is linked inexorably with the survival of their regime.
So the folks for the motion did speak about why it's important to protect the Syrian people from the current atrocities. They did highlight some of the things that 40% of the population was displaced, there's starvation, there are diseases like polio, which is rampant in Syria. In addition to that, they said that military intervention needs to be accompanied by diplomatic efforts as well. It's not just solely military intervention that would be the solution. And this is because clearly the status quo is failing, and there needs to be something different that needs to be done. And I think the Einstein quote, that's one of my favorite quotes, in fact, and it made a lot of sense. Right. The other point that the proposition, folks for the motion brought up was that there are war crimes that are occurring. There are atrocities such as chemical weapons being used. This has been tested and proven by United Nations. And as a nation, we have a responsibility to protect. This is something that is being endorsed by the UN General Assembly as well as the Security Council. And so they did not want to advocate an Iraq sort of intervention where you get boots on the ground. They wanted a more limited strike, which was something like a no-fly zone being imposed and so forth. So ultimately they wanted to just highlight that it is a lesser evil to have military intervention as it costs less, and as opposed to having no intervention or insufficient intervention. So there was very strong arguments being made by the government, and once again I would like to have it. Okay. And for the folks who were against the motion, they spoke about how the Assad regime has been marked by extreme repression. Even in the past, when there were folks who would rebel against the regime, they would put them down by imposing a lot of the repressive techniques that they had, and it was successful in the past. However, it's not being successful now because of the fact that they are getting support from outside nations. And this actually brings about the whole question of the legitimacy of the Assad government, which was brought up. They said that we should explore other options as opposed to military intervention, such as an arms embargo. And they said that if you go with the limited strike that the government said, such as airstrike, there will still be collateral damage, and that is something that needs to be accounted for. Intervention could bring rise to the ideology of rallying behind the flag, which would actually lend support to the Assad regime, which would be, in the end, counterproductive. Another important point that they did bring about was that the opposition is quite fragmented, and then that is a whole can of worms, and we don't want to get into that. And finally, the other thing is intervention is costly and unpopular, and they wanted to make an analogy to the Iraq and ask you a very thought-provoking question: is that did it reduce the suffering there? So would it then reduce the suffering in Syria? And again, those were very strong arguments as well made by the opposition. The results. So one of the things is we do know that this was an extremely engaging debate, as from the discussion component as well, and the fact that 40%, around 41% of the people who came in to this debate were undecided, but after the debate that reduced to less than 15%. So a lot of people did gain a lot of insight from the debate that occurred. And there was a side that won, but by a very small margin, however. So there was around a 4.5% difference. And The motion was unfortunately not carried as the opposition was the one that won this debate. So with the UTM liberals, without whose support we would not have been able to carry out such an amazing debate with such a variety of discussions, multitude of opinions, and I also would like to thank UTM TV for covering the event. For those of you who might have missed the event or would know somebody who would like to watch the video of this event, UTM TV did record the event and they would later put it online, so you can all watch it again. Also, I would like to thank Medium for sending a reporter here to cover our event. Thank you to the University of Toronto Mississauga for providing all the services that was there. The Political Science Department for helping us promote the debate, the Student Life Department, and most importantly, the professors. We all have been to the lectures these professors over here give out in our university, but it's a different environment when you have 4 professors, all experts in the field, coming out over here and debating each other, and getting to know a variety of views. One round of applause for the professors. I would like to invite everybody to have some snacks at the back of the room outside. Sorry, my handwriting is really bad, so I'm having a little difficulty.